and thank you so much for that previous segment. So, Ross, if you're here, I'd love if you could just introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about what you do quickly before I start with my sort of main questions.
It's really wonderful to be here, and I think it's great that there's local forums like this where people can talk about these issues. My name is Ross O'Kelly. I am a urban designer, an urban planner, and more recently have moved into rewilding, urban ecology. And last October, I started a not-for-profit called the Urban Wilding Hub, with a mission to help to mainstream urban rewilding across the UK and across Europe.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So, my first question is exactly on that. So, can you please explain to the audience what are the main principles of urban wilding slash rewilding? Thank you, if they're not familiar.
Yes, absolutely. And I'll just say on the top about terminology, we tend to say wilding. Other people say rewilding. They basically mean the same thing. It's more of a kind of a branding thing because sometimes when people hear the word rewilding, they picture a return to some sort of primeval wilderness. And when we're talking about urban areas, we really mean bringing back wildness in small and large ways. So what do we mean by rewilding? And I think, Kaya gave a great kind of introduction to this, so I won't go on too long. But I think in contrast to the traditional conservation approach, which is about protecting the biodiversity that we have, rewilding is really about taking areas that are degraded or have lost their biodiversity, their ecology, and restoring that as best we can. And it's really a way of humans stepping in to maybe fix some of the problems that we've caused in the past, bringing back species that have gone locally extinct, reducing harmful management, reducing the amount of chemicals that we're using to let natural processes start to flow. And then eventually, when we can, kind of stepping back from getting involved and just allowing nature to take its course. Um, there's millions of square kilometers across the world that are currently being rewilded. It's really gone mainstream in the last decade or so, which is really fantastic. But more recently in urban areas, this idea of rewilding or wilding has started to become more popular. And for us, what that means is it comes down to this question of restoring natural processes and reducing the harmful management that we may have been doing. So that can play out in your local garden, also in local parks, large and small, on urban rivers, watercourses, greenbelt land. There's really lots and lots of opportunities for bringing in a wilder approach and welcoming in wilder nature into cities like this.
Amazing. Thank you. So, I think you kind of started to go into this, but sort of how can urban wilding help us preserve and protect our biodiversity?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, when we're talking about the big problems of like global biodiversity loss or even national, biodiversity decline in the UK, I think really what's going to turn the tide on that is the large scale rewilding and nature restoration work, changes to our farming practices, these really big scale things. So we could kind of reasonably ask the question, well, why even bother looking at cities or urban nature when that's such a small kind of land area? But really, I think there's three kind of important reasons why we should be serious about restoring urban nature. One is that cities and urban areas are often located in what's called biodiversity hotspots. So these are places that would naturally have high levels of biodiversity and unique sort of habitats. So think of things like along the courses of rivers, in river valleys, along coastlines. These are areas where you would naturally have high biodiversity. They also tend to be good strategic locations for human settlements, which is why we have, our cities located there. So these are places where we can play a really important local role in restoring that local biodiversity that kind of should, in the past would have been much higher. The other thing is this question around actually urban areas and human infrastructure often creating barriers for the movement of animals, and for even the spread of all sorts of species. So can we provide kind of habitat corridors through our urban areas so that we can start to break down some of those barriers? That's another, I suppose, important reason to look at um, rewilding in cities. And the third one, which I think is possibly the most important, is that, particularly in Britain, the vast majority of the population lives in urban areas. So that is the nature that we're all interacting with on a daily basis. And what we know from lots of research is that people who interact meaningfully with nature, with wildlife, on a daily, weekly basis, very often have more pro-environmental and pro-nature behaviors and attitudes and voting patterns and consumption patterns. And so the more we can bring nature into people's life and make it important for them personally, the more chance we have of actually having the sort of greater growth in consciousness about protecting biodiversity, taking action on climate change, etc.
Amazing. So this kind of feeds perfectly into the next question, which I wanted to ask was what kind of urban wilding would best be suited for suburban landscapes, like sort of here in Enfield, to help us expand our biodiversity? Like you kind of talked about sort of urban corridors and into nature and things like that. So if you can kind of talk more on that, that would be perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think sort of general advice for typical, typical local authorities, typical neighborhoods in London or across England would be, first of all, and people have sort of said this already in the comments, stop using pesticides, stop spreading, poison in the landscape. Um, we really just need to shift our mindset to not needing to sort of dominate our green spaces so much, and to actually, as a first step, which a lot of people do as their first step, which is just to step back, stop mowing the lawn so much, allow the grass to grow, and just monitor it and see what happens. You could take a section of a park or a section of your local neighborhood green spaces, put up a sign and say, this is our rewilding area. We're going to let this grow. We're going to cut it once a year in the autumn, and that's it. And we're going to monitor it and we're going to do a biodiversity survey. And bringing people along on that journey can be challenging because many people aren't used to seeing this. But with the right sort of communication, I think with the right sort of organizing, we can get people around to the benefits of this. And you can also get that kind of hard scientific data of saying, look how much we increased our pollinators. Look, we had insects here we've never seen before because we have this habitat now that's developing. So that's kind of like stage one, rewilding 101 almost. Um, the other thing then is there are lots of examples in London and Enfield of really pioneering rewilding projects. So the reintroduction of beavers to several sites around London has been extremely successful, and they're looking at more locations to reintroduce beavers in East London, in Croydon, and that has huge benefits for biodiversity in terms of creating wetlands, but also the benefits to mitigating flooding in surrounding areas. You probably have seen the Ealing beavers getting lots and lots of press coverage the last week or so around how within 2 years they've reduced the flooding in the local tube station in the local area in really measurable ways. Um, and then, there's lots of examples of actually doing things more in a more ambitious way. There's even places down in Kingston, South London, where they're bringing kind of hardy breeds of cattle onto a large urban park to actually do the grass mowing in the natural way rather than using a lawnmower. And because they, have all these actions where they'll kind of dig up the soil with their hooves, where they're obviously, excreting onto the soil, that's creating opportunities for little microhabitats, for more invertebrate activity, for all these other knock-on benefits to wildlife. So there's lots and lots of examples of ways this is being done in cities. We could also look at restoring watercourses as well, really big and small examples of that from across the world. And I'm happy to send you over some case studies afterwards if that's interesting for people. But yeah, I think the opportunities are absolutely huge within towns and cities to do this. We're not lacking in opportunities. It's really just about having a shift in mindset, getting the money in there, and get cracking with it.
Yeah, so I think that sort of having that larger scale ambition is going to be so important to how we kind of tackle the biodiversity crisis that we're witnessing. But obviously, that takes a lot of resources, a lot of money, a lot of top down sort of investment. So, is there sort of any ways that you think that we could kind of do more community led projects to facilitate a more sort of bottom up approach to sort of how can people wild or wild, their homes, gardens, just local neighborhoods? How can we make a start?
Yeah, it's a great point, and I think some of the really nice projects that I've seen have been community led. And I think, these can be daunting and they can be difficult to get off the ground because it takes an element of organization. It takes people often working for free in their spare time to make these things happen. Um, but I do think they play a really important role for motivated people like yourselves who want to see change, happening locally. Um, so I think you can obviously start in your own gardens or any land that you own, and that's an obvious, first step. Many of us don't obviously have that opportunity, so you might be looking at publicly owned spaces or places on a housing estate or in a residential area or owned by a council. So I think what you could do is in your local area identify a location where you think there could be a lot more opportunity for biodiversity, where you want to put in try some of these rewilding principles, come up with some sort of a plan, and then go and speak to your local authority, speak to the landowner, whoever that might be, and try and work out an agreement where you can do that in a way that everyone's sort of in agreement, and that it's not going to get kind of bulldozed at some point because you didn't have permission or that kind of thing. So these things can happen, and I think an example that I think of, again going back to West London, Ealing. It was the Ealing Wildlife Group. It's just a group of local residents who uh, were looking at one of their large parks, which was already a pretty good meadow habitat. And they come up with this idea of actually reintroducing harvest mice, which are native small rodents, absolutely adorable, really important part of the ecosystem. And they're, a food source for birds of prey like owls. And they kind of came up with this plan. They had some nature conservation expertise within the group, and they decided they want to do it. And they got permission from the local authority, and they've been releasing, hundreds of these mice to actually have a breeding center nearby. They've organized and they're doing everything, in the appropriate, safe way. Um, so these things can happen, and I would encourage anyone to not feel powerless, but to actually have a spirit of let's get together and come up with a plan and try and make this happen. And we might have to ask a few times for it to happen, but these things can definitely happen.
We're doing a lot of work here at EnCaf, especially in terms of focusing on community climate resilience. And I was just kind of wondering, from your perspective, in what ways can, urban wilding help us deal with the local aspects of climate change that we're witnessing? As today's a perfect example, like the heat and all that. How can kind of that help us manage these local effects of climate change?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. It's a really key point for me in how I communicate about urban wilding. Um, if you imagine, so we've all had that, and you've probably done this week in the extreme heat of needing to get some relief and maybe going out into a local green space or into your garden and feeling that it is, you get some cooling benefit from being there, allows you to cool down. You can sit in the shade of a tree or something like that. So green spaces, even the sort of traditional parks that we have, they do give us that benefit of kind of cooling the air on hot days. And this can be really, really important for many, many people. But there is a fragility and a vulnerability to those very, very manicured, formal landscapes that we often have in cities. So if you've got your space and it's a mown lawn and it's a couple of feature trees, some ornamental flowers, that kind of thing, you'll get to a certain point where that will just fully basically dry out. The grass will go into dormancy. The soil will kind of become a hard pan. And at that point, it loses its ability to cool the air. And parks, I experienced this certainly when it reached 40 degrees in 2022, going into Victoria Park near where I lived at the time, and just being like, this is the same temperature as it is out on the road. There was no difference. So so if you contrast that with going into an actual natural habitat, so a woodland or somewhere with much more dense vegetation, what you have there is dozens and dozens of species of vegetation, ones that have more heat tolerance, more drought tolerance than others, which will keep being alive and keep releasing the water into the air, which actually creates that cooling effect. You're probably getting more shade if have that more dense vegetation around, but also the fact that in a sort of woodland or a dense, mature grassland or something, that will help to contain its moisture much better. So it will actually, the whole ecosystem will stay alive for longer and will be more resilient to those kind of heat waves. So that's for me is a key point of why we need wilder spaces, why we need what real habitats in cities, is they will just be more resilient to the effects of climate change, and therefore will give us, the more benefits as we face more of these like hotter summers. And I've already mentioned a little bit about flood resilience. Beavers work an amazing magic, but it doesn't have to be only beavers. You know, getting in depaving spaces that have unnecessary amounts of concrete or asphalt, replacing that with soil, with vegetation, bringing in, creating more ponds, which are fantastic for biodiversity, but can also help to store some of that rainwater. Lots of really proven techniques that we can employ on a local level to make us more resilient to climate change.